we're going to be discussing the ultimate management this evening. And so far, you'll appreciate that we have been dealing predominantly with managing one's affairs in business. And again, business not limited or restricted to the running of a company or a business, but anything that you do. So you could be a mother, that's your business. You could be a student, so your business would be to study. You could be a number of things, a number of fields of activity in which people engage, and that becomes your business. That's what you do. And we've mentioned this before. So up until now, we've been talking about managing your worldly affairs, as it were. And this includes, of course, your relationships and how to most effectively manage and conduct yourself within a relationship. This lesson sort of shifts gears, as it were, and we move into a far more subtler subject this evening, touching on this concept which the layman calls as God. So he says in the book, management encompasses every part, facet, and phase of human life. It is not restricted to business and family as understood by people in general. A human being, the suprememost of species, has the competence to gain complete suzerainty over the world, a status that could be achieved by self-management and mastery over one's self. So again, we've brought up this concept again and again, this idea of life management. What is life management? Well, life management, as you'll appreciate by now, is nothing but self-management. And that is managing your own self. Essentially, what this boils down to is the intellect governing the mind in all your actions and activities. So when we say that the intellect is in complete control of the personality, in other words, it has complete mastery over the mind and then directs the body into action accordingly, we say that you have managed to manage your life. So you've gained mastery, as it were, over your little self. And what this essentially means is you've gained mastery over the world. And this is the sort of intention, or this is the state that we strive to achieve, is to, in our lives, is to attain some degree or the ultimate degree of life management, where you are in an equanimous state and a relative state of peace and happiness throughout the challenges that present themselves. See, in life, there will be many challenges. We can't avoid those. They keep coming. That's one aspect of life that remains sort of constant. But what we need to appreciate is that those challenges should not override or affect our sense of well-being. See, the problem we have is that whenever the challenges arrive, what happens? Well, we tend to buckle with that challenge. Okay, we may finally overcome it or rise above it, but we go through a period of stress or strain when dealing with that particular challenge, whatever it could be, in a relationship, at business, many different avenues which present themselves to us in the form of a challenge. Now, what we need to appreciate is that even in and through these challenges, we need to maintain a sense of peace and happiness. And that's essentially what he's talking about when he talks about mastery over oneself. If you're able to do that, then you have mastery over the world. No amount or form or severity of challenges can disturb you. So the reason, there's a very good reason why this chapter comes at the end of the book. Obviously, literally and figuratively. Literally, you need a certain amount of preparation, which we've undertaken over the last 11 weeks, in order to even grapple with this concept that he's going to present tonight. And likewise, in any course of study, you'll appreciate that there's a certain gradation or a certain sequence of thought that you need to progress through, starting with some basics and fundamentals and slowly building up in complexity of ideas. And this is no different. Figuratively, while we talk about this ultimate manage at the end of the book, because in order to start probing and appreciating and living this idea of achieving ultimate management, there's a certain amount of worldly management that needs to be attained. In other words, a certain level of proficiency in managing your life. Once this has been established, then it's possible to start contemplating on higher values, higher truths of life. Obviously, they're not divorced of one another, but this is the sequence of progression. So he goes on to say, in the execution of line management, the higher level of authority exercises control over the lower. It would therefore be necessary to study the echelons of management in human affairs. The levels start from the physical body and rise gradually to the supreme self within. So again, we appreciate this idea of higher levels of management controlling the lower. These ideas, again, were presented in the form of the leadership, where you have one person at the top governing and controlling what happens with the rest of the company. So from the CEO, it filters through all the way down through management, cadre, and eventually laborers and people who are doing the work at the level of labor or factory. So there is an establishment of hierarchy in terms of management. And we see this not only in business, but we see this in nature. And what is more applicable to us is to see it existing within our own personality. And this is where he talks about the echelons of management in human affairs. So when we look and talk about this hierarchy in management, what we need to appreciate is that management essentially is talking about control. So if you are able to manage your company, that means you are in control of the company. It's thriving and productive. If you're managing your family affairs well, that means you're in control. Things are flowing in the right direction. There's a productive and prosperous unit established. Similarly, with your worldly affairs, if you are essentially able to manage all your affairs, all that means is you're in control of them. You're in control of what's happening within your life. Now, with hierarchy comes this idea of subtlety. And this is an important concept. And it clears up a lot of not only misconceptions, but doubts. So when we talk about subtlety, we're talking essentially about two aspects here, and that is pervasiveness and control. Control we've touched on slightly, and this is what establishes the hierarchy, but pervasiveness is another way in which we can establish a form of hierarchy. So the more pervasive something is, the more subtler it is. The more controlling it is, the more subtler it is. So we can establish this statement of fact that subtle controls the gross. If you look at it in terms of business, subtle would be the person at the top, the thinker, the implementer, the planner, trying to in every way move the company forward. And then that filters through. So when we talk about pervasiveness in terms of the human personality, where the gross exists, the subtle also exists, but it exists beyond that too. In other words, where there is a body, the mind exists there too. But the mind is not limited to the body. The mind exists beyond it. So this is pervasiveness. So when something exists and then it exists beyond that as well, it's more pervading. It pervades beyond that typical substance, beyond that particular element, or beyond that particular equipment. Now, when we talk about control, what we have to understand is that the subtle controls the gross. The subtler aspects of your personality will always control the gross levels of your personality. So there's a clear direction of causation. See, in the first lecture, what we talked about was this idea of these three equipments, introducing you to the concept of a human being being a body, mind, and an intellect. And we appreciate that the body is like a vehicle. But the body by itself cannot act. The body is driven into action by either the mind or the intellect. So when the mind drives the body to act, we talk about impulsive, indiscriminate actions. These actions have no bearing on increasing our sense of well-being. We'll again appreciate that it is the intellect that is subtler than even the mind and the body. So the intellect is more controlling, is more pervasive than the mind or the body. See, the mind is restricted to its area of knowledge, its area of known. When we talk about the mind, we talk about memory. We talk about a storehouse of memory. It is the intellect that can take that information and project something unknown. This is why the intellect is able to conceive and create thoughts and ideas of things yet to be discovered or yet to be created. This is the intellect's capacity. Therefore, it is more pervasive and more controlling than the mind. So just for all purposes, all you have to remember is that subtle controls the gross. It's never the other way around. It's not opposite of that. It's not that the gross controls the subtle. That can never happen. So when somebody says, if you want a calm mind, just breathe. No amount of physical gross activity can control the subtle mind. And you can start applying this principle in any area of your expertise, in any area of your practice. It must flow down through a direction of causation from hierarchy, from the subtle to the gross. Okay, is everyone okay? So he goes on to say, the body is controlled, governed by the mind, but the mind has no control over its direction or dimension. It can drive perception and action to any limits. The mind per se has no means of regulating or moderating its movement, even at the point of extinction. The vagaries of the mind can, however, be controlled by the intellect. The intellect occupies a higher level of authority than the mind. A well-developed intellect can give the mind the right direction and a realistic goal to pursue and attain. So again, this is what we've just mentioned, this hierarchy that exists within the human personality. So the actions of the body driven by the mind. The mind has this ability to drive actions, but again, the mind has a limitation in its functioning. The mind is not equipped to make choices. That is the role of the intellect. And when you fortify the intellect, when you strengthen the intellect, it gains suzerainty over the mind, gains control over the mind, and directs the actions productively. So when we talk about this hierarchy in the individual, the grossest aspect of the personality, at the lower rung of the hierarchy, let's call it, is the body, this material, physical personality. Subtler than the body is the mind. Subtler than the mind is the gross intellect. And subtler than the gross intellect is the subtle intellect. The subtlest of all is the self. Now, body, mind, intellect, you would appreciate and you would have heard. We're introducing two concepts that you may not be familiar with, and that is the subtle intellect and the self. So when we talk about the subtle intellect, we up until now have been focusing our attention, focusing our investigation into this realm of what we call as the gross intellect. Now we're talking about subtle intellect. So he says, human beings are privileged with the possession of this subtle intellect, known in Sanskrit language as Sukshma Buddhi, whose range goes beyond the terrestrial realm to reach the transcendental reality. Whereas the intellect that is used to manage the affairs of the world is known as Tikshna Buddhi, gross intellect. The subtle intellect is the next higher level in the hierarchy of management. A human alone is empowered to use it to contact the transcendental reality, which the populace has from time immemorial designated as God. So again, he's bringing in this concept here of two intellects now. We've only been talking about the gross intellect up until now, but now he refers to that aspect which we call as the subtle intellect, Sukshma Buddhi. Now, don't have to get confused here. What we have to remember is that the role of the intellect remains the same. And that is to differentiate, to discriminate. That's essentially what the intellect does. So same thing it's doing. But as we're going to see, it's just functioning in two different fields of activity. So when we talk about the gross intellect, now, again, the gross intellect is engaged in discriminating anything in the world, differentiating what we can call as between the pairs of opposites. Now, anything in the world, anything that you see or perceive, should I say, anything that exists within the world is defined either by quality or property, form, function, or the capacity to change. So anything you look at, anything you hear, anything you can perceive through any one of your senses will fall under one of these. It has a quality. Even if you hear a sound, that's a beautiful sound. That's the quality of sound. When we talk about form, when we perceive something, it has a certain form. But more interesting, even subtler aspects. So if we were to say, talk about emotions or feelings, those change. They're subject to change. You're not always happy. Sometimes you're sad. You're not always excited. Sometimes you're calm. So even the emotions change. So that still falls within the level of the world, within this terrestrial realm of existence. So quality, property, form, function, change. These all pertain to the terrestrial realm. And when I say terrestrial realm, what that means is the universe, the world that we experience, the world that we perceive, the world in which we exist. World not limited to just that external to us, but pertaining to the equipments too. See, it is through the equipments that we gain this experience of the world. And when I say equipments, I'm referring to the body, mind, and the intellect. So the world, as it were, is the equipments plus everything that exists within this periphery of our experience. So when we talk again about the gross intellect and its function, and that's why we say even the gross intellect pertains to the world, because it has a function. So that role is to recognize something from something that it's not. This is one of the roles of the intellect. And as mentioned, it discriminates between these pairs of opposites. Now, you'll appreciate in the world, there are innumerable pairs of opposites, hundreds of thousands of millions of pairs of opposites. The gross intellect's role distinguishes between these two. Of course, there's more functionality to it, but we're just honing in on this fundamental functionality of the intellect, this ability to discriminate. So again, when we're referring to the gross intellect and its area of application, we're referring to terrestrial. And as mentioned, this is comprised of quality, property, form, function, or change. Moving into this idea or this concept or this equipment, if you were, of the subtle intellect, the sukshma buddhi in Sanskrit. So where we have the gross intellect differentiating, discriminating between the innumerable pairs of opposites pertaining to the terrestrial realm, the subtle intellect is reduced to the discrimination between one pair of opposite. Now it discriminates between world, the entire world, and not world, or the terrestrial and non-terrestrial. When I say non-terrestrial, I mean that which lies beyond the terrestrial realm of existence. In other words, the transcendental. Now, it is the subtle intellect that allows a human being alone. See, if we look at all other beings, sentient beings, all other creatures, plants, whatever you take into account, none of them has this subtle intellect. As mentioned earlier on, we know a plant has a body, a form. But plants, by all means, don't express emotion. Most certainly can't create thoughts. Again, when we looked at the animal, I don't know if any of you remember this table. It's in the book here if you take a look. You looked at the animal, and what we saw in the animal was, yes, the animal possesses a body, but it also possesses emotions, implying presence of mind. Because we see animals, the way they interact, there is a clear display of emotions, whether it's to a friend or foe. In other words, a threat or something that is not a threat. We see this display of emotions between parents and their children in the animal kingdom I'm talking about. So we say, yes, animals, clear display of emotions. But for all purposes, animals don't have a intellect. And you'll see in the book, there's a tick with a cross through it. And what that means is, yes, we can say that there is a rudimentary gross intellect functioning within animals, but an animal cannot claim to think originally and independently. Then we look at a human being, and a human being has a body, a mind, and an intellect, but also is in possession of what we call as the subtle intellect. And that subtle intellect, coming back, is that which allows us to posit something beyond the terrestrial realm of existence. In other words, it allows us to posit the existence of God, God. We're giving that name God to anything that lies beyond the terrestrial realm of our experience, beyond the body, beyond the mind, and beyond the intellect. So the function of the subtle intellect is to identify with this idea, this concept, or the self within. Without a subtle intellect, you cannot start even beginning contemplating upon the transcendental. You cannot think of God. See, even if we look at an atheist, let's say, an atheist rejects the idea of God. Now, what allows him or her to even posit the existence of something beyond the world is a subtle intellect. So they conceptualize this idea, is there a God? And then rejects it. They have their reasons. But still, the subtle intellect is there, which allows them that question. So he goes on to say, the supreme reality is inconceivable even by humans. But the subtle intellect posits the reality as something that transcends the terrestrial world and helps you further to contact it in the self within. In terms of management, a fully developed gross intellect could at best deal with and exercise control over mundane matters. Thus achieve for you all management within the realm of this world. Whereas the subtle intellect helps you identify with the supreme self within. When the identification with the self is complete, you become one with the self, gain total suzerainty over the world, attain the ultimate management. Now we're going to talk about this ultimate management and gaining control over the world in a bit. But again, this is just driving home this idea. See, with the gross intellect, and that's been the course up until now, with the gross intellect, through fortification of the gross intellect, which comes through questioning, which comes through not taking things for granted, which comes through self-analysis and study, we're able to fortify that thinking capacity within us. That intellect, that gross intellect, once fortified, is capable of meeting the ever-presenting challenges of life. It enables one to gain objectivity and view the world as it is. Many, many things the gross intellect is able to do. But one thing is for certain, it enables us to meet life. It gives us the ability to make productive, effective, right choices and usher in a sense of peace and calm. However, the subtle intellect goes beyond that. It's one thing gaining management over the world and worldly affairs, and we're saying that's if you're able to even attain that, it shows a lot of prowess. It shows a lot of strength and character. But for all argument's sakes, that is not our purpose here. Of course, that's a level of attainment, a level of achievement that many of us will aspire for. But beyond that, and this is where the role of the subtle intellect comes in, beyond that is the attainment of something greater, of something higher. And that is this attainment of what they call in the Sanskrit text as self-realization, God realization. That is the birthright of every human being, to unite with that higher power, whatever you call it, whatever you want to phrase it as, God. So the subtle intellect not only allows us to posit the existence, but allows us to pursue it and eventually attain it. So it talks about the self within. Now, this may be a new concept for some of you. And again, when we talk about the self, you flash back to the beginning. We said, what is a human being? A human being is nothing but three equipments: a body, a mind, and an intellect, enlivened by spirit. So a human being is spirit plus matter. That spirit, we are referring to the self within. The word given in Sanskrit language is Atman. Atman means God, or the self within. So if we look at it, the self is the part of the personality which isn't defined in terms of quality, property, form, function, or change. Again, remember we said these pertain to the world, these pertain to the equipments. So now we're saying that the self, or God, or Atman, cannot be defined by this. And for us, that presents a challenge, because that's all we relate to, that's all we can comprehend. So it becomes almost impossible for us to conceive of something that is not in possession of one of these things. Because the self per se transcends the limitations of these three equipments: the body, the mind, and the intellect. That's why we say the self is the subtlest aspect of your personality. It is the top of the hierarchy. It is that enlivening conscious force, or that conscious principle, enlivening the body, mind, and intellect to perceive and act, feel and think. Just as electricity and gadgets. Now, when we look at any gadget that's driven by electricity, or enlivened by electricity, or powered by electricity, you've got the gadget per se. Now, this could be anything from a heater to a refrigerator, two opposite ends of the spectrum. Both cannot function without electricity. Similarly, these equipments that we have, every human being is in possession of, cannot function without this enlivening principle. That enlivening principle we refer to as God, the self, or even the changeless reality. Changeless because it doesn't change. Now, when you say it doesn't change, what do we mean by this? The closest example we can give is love. Now, when we say true love, when we talk about true love does not change. So often in fact, I watched a movie, or it was a book, I can't actually remember, it was a long time ago. But the gist of the story was a mother's love for a son. And the story went, and I'm just giving a sort of excerpt of the story. This young boy, he grew up, and it wasn't that he came from a troubled home, but the mother, no matter what this boy did, the mother always supported him, always loved him, no matter what. At school, he was bullied, or he got into trouble. The mother would be there to pick him up, to take care of him and bring him home. Then the boy left school, and he got into all sorts of nefarious activities, and he ended up in jail. And as soon as he got out, the mother brought him back home, and made sure that he had a fresh bath and his best food, everything. So it didn't matter what that child did. That mother's love was unchanging. It didn't change. The love we experience nowadays is constantly changing. No, I love you, but don't tell me you're going to go play golf with your friends this weekend. Then I definitely don't love you anymore. It wavers. Similarly, what is that changeless reality? Something that doesn't change, something that is constant. See, if we look at quality, property, form, function, they all are changing in a way. Everything pertaining to the world changes. Even our equipment's change. What Vedanta is saying is there is something unchanging. We give that unchanging aspect of our personality the name of the self or God, beyond this terrestrial experience. So again, the subtle intellect empowers a human to identify with the self. The self is the living principle, conscious principle, pure consciousness, which enlivens the matter vestures to manifest as living beings. It is homogeneous, the unifying principle in the heterogeneous creatures of the world. So we see, if we look at the gadgets example again, if we go back to this idea of the gadgets, so many gadgets are there doing so many different things, but the commonality without which none of the gadgets can function is electricity. It's that power that enlivens, enables. Just so, there is some homogeneous, unifying principle that enlivens all sentient beings to function. Now, all sentient beings have various material equipments or components and will hence function according to their particular nature. We touched on this idea in relationships. No two minds are the same. No two individuals are the same. All are different. You may even have a twin, can be completely different. You may look the same, but the inner mechanism, the inner personality, completely different. But there is something. There is this unifying principle underneath all this changing terrestrial phenomenon. Some unifying principle that is the substratum on which this entire pluralistic phenomenon we call the world exists. This is what we are investigating. In fact, this is the message of Vedanta. So he goes on to say, and he brings in three concepts here. And that is identifying with the self, gaining supremacy of the self, and reaching the ultimatum of the self. So we're going to just break down these three ideas. So the first he talks about is to gain identity with the self. That's an error there. To identify with someone or something, you need to send your thoughts in that direction. And when your thoughts are firmly established in it, you become one with it. The law of nature is such: as you think, so you become. The rare one uses the subtle intellect to identify with the self, realizes the self, the pinnacle of all management, all control. The self-realized enlightened soul operating from the self establishes complete suzerainty over the universe. So when we are discussing self-development, and this is what we have been, this is the entire course, this is entire Vedanta, is this practice of developing one's self, chastening, purifying the inner personality, as it were. Not just the inner personality, even at a material physical level, we are attempting to improve. If you're on the trajectory of self-improvement, self-development, this is a practice you can engage in. So at the heart of self-development is this ability to consciously identify with something subtler or something higher. So we are trying to restructure, we are trying to reconstitute the personality. See, everyone is at a certain level of development. And that doesn't matter. What's more important is the direction. The direction is to improve. The direction is to gain mastery, not only, as we now appreciate, over one's self and one's world, but to attain the absolute mastery, and that's identification with the self. So when we say the self-development practice, what we're doing is we are pitching higher and higher ideals. We are educating ourselves on higher values of life and living, and then attempting to drive our personality to reach there, to get established in that better way of functioning. Now, when he's talking about the self, remember, it's the top of the hierarchy. We are attempting to identify with something that is changeless, a changeless reality, not subject to any of these forms, properties, or anything like that. When we are able to identify, and this is why he says identify with the self, or identity with the self, gain that identity. He says, when we identify with this changeless reality, what happens then is that when everything around and about us, our bodies, for example, our bodies may get ill, they may malfunction, they get old, that's for certain. Even with regards to the external environment, constant change, our emotions, our mind, even the intellect, all changing. Now, if we are able to identify with this changeless reality, what happens? We are not affected by all that changes. See, I'll give you a simple example. If you identify completely with the body, when the body gets hot, when it gets hot, you say, I'm hot, and you're flustered. Then winter's on its way. Ooh, cold, I'm cold, I'm cold. Again, disturbed, affected by fluctuations in the temperature. That applies to every facet of your personality. When profits come at the material level, see, I've just got a deposit in the bank. Great news. Next day, oh my God. Oh, I didn't realize I didn't pay for that. Something's come off the bank. Profit and loss affects us. Joy and sorrow. Joyous occasion comes. Everyone's happy, you're jumping around. A sorrowful situation comes, what happens? Sink, you go down. The point here is that you are affected. Now, the only way that you can not be affected is by gaining the absolute level of objectivity. And that entails identifying with something that doesn't change. If you're able to identify with something that doesn't change, by all means, the body, mind, and intellect will still be subject to their various influences. The body will get cut, it'll bleed, there will be pain. But if you are identifying with something higher, you're not affected by it. I'll give you a simple example. You're sitting outside, and what happens? You reach for your glass of water, and by mistake, you put your hand on a bee that's sitting on your glass. Prick. You feel a pinch. It's sore. You're irritated. And now you're flustered and I need this and this, and there's a big furore. Now imagine a few weeks later, you go to your local shopping center. What are they doing? Blood drive. It's a good thing to do. Let me engage with this. So you sit down, put a talkie around your arm there, and in the needle goes. Do you go through the same experience as when the bee stung you? You don't jump around and sting, sting, sting. No. Why is that? It's the same thing. A prick of a needle, the prick of a sting. It's the same thing. In the first context, you've identified with the body. So you're affected by it. In the second example, or in the second scenario, what are you identifying with? Well, you're identifying with something higher. You're identifying with giving blood to perhaps save someone's life. So you're not identifying with the pain that the body goes through. No doubt, you feel the prick is still there. But because you're identifying with something higher, something nobler, something greater, you are unaffected by that sting. The same principle, you can apply that same example into every other facet of your personality. So when a joyous occasion comes, we're not saying don't be joyous or don't be sorrowful, but don't get affected by it. In other words, let the body, mind, and intellect go through and express its particular nature. We're not talking about suppression here. We're not saying, I don't get cold. Winter's night, you go outside with a t-shirt and shorts. No. I don't feel cold. You'll end up getting a cold. That's suppression. Yes, the body is subject to these forces, but that shouldn't impinge on your sense of overall well-being. When you're able to identify with something higher, you're able to avert this. So when we say this subjective sense of well-being isn't diminished, it isn't affected by whatever happens at the various levels of these equipments. So that is the first aspect, to gain the identity with self. The next is attain supremacy of self. So you could use the subtle intellect. Again, he's driving in this idea of the subtle intellect. It's coming up again and again because it pertains to the self. You could use the subtle intellect to rise above the world by drawing the divinity within you, by asserting the supreme self within and negating the matter vestures, by maintaining a constant awareness of self. I am the self, not this body. I am the self, not this mind. I am the self, not this gross intellect. I am the self, not this subtle intellect. Thus must you identify with the self while you perceive and act with your body, feel emotions with your mind, comprehend thoughts with your intellect. You would gradually get attached to the self and detached, liberated from constraints and limitations of the body, mind, and intellect, and their worldly entanglement. Reign supreme, attain the supremacy of self. So this is a particular practice that he describes to gain that identification with the self. And that is this idea of negation and assertion. So in this practice, what you're essentially doing is negating all these false personalities, all these changing aspects of you. Understanding that these, these are all limited and constricted. The body is limited, the mind, and even the intellect is limited. It's limited by its own particular nature. By negating those and asserting that changeless reality, you gain that supremacy. So when you think of the body, often we say, when we describe ourselves, yeah, I'm 6 feet tall, I'm white, I have brown hair, green eyes. You're describing the body. So to shift this identification off the body, remember, if you're identifying with the body, means your thoughts, identification is nothing but establishment of a thought flow. So as soon as you identify with your body, you driving your thoughts towards the body, you become attached to the body. So how do we break this attachment? By shifting the thoughts. How do we do that? By saying, I'm not this body. I am the owner of the body. Similarly, I am not the mind. I am the possessor of the mind. It's my equipment. I'm not the intellect. I'm not these thoughts. I'm the one who's cognizant of these thoughts. I don't know if any of you remember in the beginning, we talked about the subject-object relationship and creation of an experience. The subject, you, meets the object, world, to create an experience. Similarly, what we're saying here is that subject now shifts. The subject now is that self, that enlivening principle. The object being the matter vestures, the equipments. So when the self contacts the body, there is a certain expression, similarly with the mind and the intellect. So when you shift your attention from the equipments onto the self that changes reality within, slowly you gain that supremacy. The body, mind, and intellect become the objects of experience. All the time you are fortifying this idea, strengthening this idea that I'm not the object of experience. I'm not this body. I am the subject within that is living this experience. Finally, he talks about the ultimatum of self, reach ultimatum of self. The self is the ultimate state of being, the experience transcending all that the terrestrial world can offer, the state of absolute satisfaction, contentment, satiation, while all terrestrial experiences are found wanting, limited, insatiable. So for many people, this idea, when you start talking about this idea of God or something, whatever word you give it, the transcendental reality, it's sometimes can be a little difficult concept to appreciate, depending on backgrounds and depending on previous education, whatever it is, biases and that. So one of the ways we often use to describe this state of being, because it is a state of being, and that is by saying it is the absolute state of peace and happiness. Now, we all are aware that we have attained happiness before. We attained peace before. We've attained joy and bliss before. So what happened? Well, we lost it because it fluctuates. It's not that you're always in bliss. You're blissful and then you come out of bliss and then you got desires to fulfill and you've got challenges to overcome and all of this. So this state of peace and happiness that we're striving for is temporary. Everything we know in the world is temporary bouts of peace and bliss, punctuated by sorrow and unhappiness. So when we talk about the self, when we talk about God, all we are saying is this is a state where there is absolute peace and bliss. In other words, it's eternal. It doesn't change. It's everlasting. Now, no matter if you found it and lost it, this is the goal of every individual, to attain an everlasting state of peace and bliss. If you had attained everlasting peace and bliss, would there be anything you need to do, or anywhere you need to go, or anything left to be achieved? It's the ultimate state of achievement. Nothing can be added or taken away. Well, I'm going to give you $1 billion. You're already in a permanent state of bliss. How's that going to change anything? I'm going to take away all your earnings. It doesn't matter. Because you're already happy and peaceful, permanently. So this is one of the ways in which we refer to the self. Absolute satisfaction, contentment, satiation. The next thing it talks about is this idea of waking, dream, and deep sleep states. So in the passage of life, you fail to realize the absolute supremacy of yourself. Living in ignorance of yourself, you identify with the material layers of your personality. As a result, you go through the perennial cycle of the waking, dream, and deep sleep states of consciousness. In the waking state, you assume the character of the waker experiencing the waking world. In the dream state, you assume the character of the dreamer experiencing the dream world. In the deep sleep state, you become the deep sleeper experiencing a void, nothing. The self pervades these three states and exists per se beyond them. The supreme state of the unmanifest self above the three manifested states is known in Sanskrit as Turiya. So this is why he calls it as the ultimate state. In other words, it's unsurpassed. It's the ultimate state of consciousness. See, we're continually going through these three states: waking, dream, deep sleep, waking, dream, deep sleep. These are the only states we are aware of. What Vedanta is saying is there is a fourth state beyond these limited states. See, the waking, dream, and deep sleep state are all limited. Now, Turiya, or fourth, is a limitless or an unconditioned state, per se. Now, as a deep sleeper, the lowest form, this is a state of void, nothingness. There's nothing happening there. Now, above that is the dreamer. The dreamer can appreciate the deep sleep state. The deep sleep state can only be in that state. It cannot appreciate the dream state. While you're in deep sleep, there's nothing. But a dreamer can say, oh, I had a great sleep last night. So the dreamer has an appreciation for the dream state that he's experiencing, the dream reality, as well as the deep sleep state. The waker, on the other hand, appreciates this waking world that he's a part of. He can also appreciate that he was dreaming last night, or he may even say, I had a deep sleep, sound sleep, beautiful sleep. I hope I have another one like that tonight. So there's even a hierarchy within these states. Now, one of the ways in which, and this is a very useful contribution of this philosophy, is that there is a comparison that exists between the dream state and the waking state. So a dreamer only becomes awaker when he wakes up. The dreamer can never cognize or appreciate the waking world while he's still dreaming. Similarly with the waking state, we cannot comprehend or appreciate a fourth state until we wake up to that state of consciousness. So this fourth state, Turiya, which is the self, is unsurpassed. It is higher or is above all these three conditioned states of consciousness. Not only that, it is the substratum on which the other three exist. See, where does the dream state come from? Well, the dream state is nothing but the projection of the waker's mind. Similarly, where does the entire waking world come from? The waking world is nothing but a projection upon that substratum, which we call as the immaculate reality or the self. So he says, the idea of the self, or that state of consciousness that is unconditioned and unconstrained. In other words, when we look at all the other three states, there's some conditioning, there's some constraint, there's some limitation. With the self, none of that is there. Hence the ultimatum. I don't know if any of you picked up these ideas. The identity, supremacy, and ultimatum. But there's a trilogy, the Born series. So it's Born Identity, Born Supremacy, and Born Ultimatum. These three series. I think they made a fourth one. Anyway, Swamiji really enjoyed these films and hence managed to weave it into this idea. Okay, right.